Harlem, New York. August 17th, 1955. It was 9:47 p.m. on a humid Wednesday evening when Bumpy Johnson's black Cadillac turned onto Lenox Avenue, heading toward his apartment on West 139th Street. Johnson was 50 years old, had controlled Harlem's criminal operations for over 2 decades, and was returning home after a business meeting at the Palm Cafe, where he'd spent 3 hours resolving a territorial dispute between 2 numbers runners who worked for his organization. The meeting had been tedious, but necessary, the kind of managerial work that kept Harlem's illegal gambling operations running smoothly and profitably. Johnson was tired, was looking forward to getting home, was thinking about the bourbon he'd pour himself once he arrived. But as the Cadillac slowed for a red light at the intersection of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street, Johnson saw something through the car window that made him tell his driver to stop immediately. If you're watching this story about the night Bumpy Johnson confronted the NYPD and changed Harlem forever, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the dark stories that shaped American civil rights and organized crime. On the sidewalk approximately 50 feet from where Johnson's car had stopped, 2 white NYPD officers were beating a black man, not arresting him with reasonable force, not subduing a violent suspect who was resisting arrest, beating him. The man was on the ground, was curled into a defensive position, trying to protect his head and his body, while the 2 officers stood over him, taking turns swinging their nightsticks, hitting him repeatedly on his back. His shoulders, his legs, his arms, each blow made a sickening thud that Johnson could hear even through the closed car window. The man on the ground was screaming, begging them to stop, saying he hadn't done anything wrong, saying, "Please, please, I have children." But the officers kept swinging their nightsticks, kept hitting him, kept delivering blows that would leave bruises and possibly broken bones. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, approximately 20 Harlem residents, all black, all watching this beating occur, all clearly horrified, but also clearly terrified to intervene. Because intervening when NYPD officers were beating someone meant you'd be the next person on the ground getting beaten. It meant you'd be arrested for assaulting a police officer or for interfering with police business. It meant your life would be destroyed by a criminal justice system that always, always sided with white police officers over black civilians, regardless of what actually happened. So the crowd watched, helpless, angry, ashamed of their helplessness, but understanding that trying to stop this beating would result in more beatings, more arrests, more lives destroyed. This was 1955 Harlem. This was how police treated black people, with impunity, with violence, with absolute certainty that they could do whatever they wanted because the system protected them and punished anyone who challenged their authority. Bumpy Johnson sat in his car for approximately 5 seconds, watching this scene unfold, processing what he was seeing, making a decision that would define his legacy more than any criminal operation he'd ever run, more than any gang war he'd ever won, more than any amount of money he'd ever made. Johnson was a criminal, was a gangster who'd killed people, who'd ordered murders, who'd built his empire through violence and intimidation. But Johnson was also a Harlem man, was someone who'd grown up experiencing the same police brutality that every black person in Harlem experienced, was someone who understood that these 2 officers beating this man on Lenox Avenue represented something larger than just one incident of violence. They represented a system, a power structure, a reality where black people were treated as less than human by the very people who were supposed to protect them. And Bumpy Johnson decided he wasn't going to let it continue. Not tonight. Not on his street. Not while he had the power to stop it. Johnson opened the car door, stepped out onto Lenox Avenue, and began walking toward the 2 officers. His driver, William Hewlett, immediately got out of the car and followed, understanding that whatever Johnson was about to do was going to be dangerous and was going to require backup. The crowd on the sidewalk saw Johnson approaching and recognized him instantly. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson, knew his face, knew his reputation, knew he was someone who commanded respect and who was absolutely fearless in situations where most men would be terrified. The two officers were so focused on beating the man on the ground that they didn't notice Johnson approaching until he was 10 feet away. Then one of the officers, a tall Irish cop named Patrick O'Sullivan, looked up and saw this well-dressed black man in an expensive suit walking directly toward them with an expression on his face that suggested he was about to do something the officers wouldn't like. "That's far enough," O'Sullivan said, holding up one hand while keeping his nightstick in the other hand. "This is police business. You need to step back and move along before you get arrested for interfering." Johnson didn't stop walking, didn't slow down, didn't show any sign that he was intimidated by O'Sullivan's command or by the nightstick he was holding. Johnson walked until he was standing directly between the two officers and the man on the ground, positioning his body so that the officers couldn't continue beating their victim without going through Johnson first. "You're going to stop hitting this man," Johnson said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made the crowd on the sidewalk go completely silent. "You're going to step away from him. You're going to call an ambulance because I can see from here that he needs medical attention. And then you're going to leave this street and never come back." The second officer, a shorter but heavily built cop named Thomas Brennan, stared at Johnson with an expression that combined shock and rage. "Who the hell do you think you are? You're telling police officers what to do? You think because you run some gambling operations in this neighborhood that you have authority over us? Let me explain something to you, boy. We're the law. We can do whatever we want. And right now, what we want is to teach this N-word a lesson about respecting police authority. So you're going to step aside, or we're going to arrest you for obstruction, and then we're going to beat you, just like we're beating him." Johnson smiled, not a friendly smile, a cold smile that several people in the crowd would later describe as the most frightening thing they'd ever seen, because it suggested Johnson wasn't afraid, wasn't intimidated, was actually looking forward to what was about to happen. "My name is Ellsworth Johnson," Johnson said quietly. "People call me Bumpy. And I'm not asking you to stop beating this man. I'm telling you. You have two choices. You can call an ambulance, you can help this man get medical attention, and you can leave peacefully. Or you can try to arrest me, and we'll see how that works out for you." O'Sullivan and Brennan exchanged glances. They were used to people being afraid of them. Used to black civilians backing down when confronted by white police authority. They weren't used to someone standing their ground, challenging them, suggesting that trying to arrest him would somehow work out badly for the officers. The sheer audacity of what Johnson was doing, standing between two armed police officers and their victim, calmly telling them to stop, shocked both officers into momentary indecision. This is where everything changes in Harlem. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe, because what happens in the next 2 minutes became legend. Brennan made the first move. He raised his nightstick and took a step toward Johnson, clearly intending to hit Johnson the same way he'd been hitting the man on the ground. But before Brennan could swing the nightstick, William Hewlett stepped forward, pulled back his jacket to reveal a .45 automatic in a shoulder holster, and said very quietly, "You swing that stick at Mr. Johnson, and I'll put a bullet in your knee." The crowd gasped. The 20 Harlem residents watching this confrontation understood immediately that the situation had escalated beyond anything they'd ever witnessed. A black man was threatening to shoot a white police officer. In 1955 New York, on a public street, in front of witnesses. This was unprecedented. This was the kind of thing that got black men killed by police, that triggered riots, that brought the full weight of the criminal justice system down on entire communities. But Johnson held up one hand to Hewlett. Put the gun away, bub. Nobody's shooting anybody tonight. Then Johnson turned back to the two officers. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to help this man to his feet. You're going to call an ambulance, and then you're going to leave. You're not going to arrest me. You're not going to arrest him. You're not going to file a report about what happened here tonight. Because if you do any of those things, I'm going to make one phone call. One phone call to people you don't want me calling. People who have authority over you. People who will be very interested to learn that 2 NYPD officers were beating a black man on Lenox Avenue for no reason. People who will wonder why you were in Harlem tonight in the first place, since this isn't your assigned patrol area. People who might start asking questions about what else you've been doing in Harlem, about whether you've been taking money from businesses for protection, about whether you've been running your own side operations that the NYPD doesn't know about. Johnson paused, let his words sink in. I know who you are, Officer O'Sullivan. I know who you are, Officer Brennan. I know where you work. I know which precinct you're assigned to. I know which commanders you report to. And I know things about you that you don't want anyone else knowing. So here's the deal. You stop this beating right now. You leave this street. And we all forget this happened. Or I make that phone call, and your careers end tomorrow morning. The truth was that Bumpy Johnson did have the connections he was claiming, had relationships with corrupt NYPD officials at multiple levels, had information about police corruption that he could use as leverage when necessary, had the ability to make life very difficult for police officers who crossed him. But more importantly, Johnson had a reputation for being someone who followed through on threats, someone who didn't bluff, someone who, if he said he'd make a phone call that would end your career, would actually make that phone call. O'Sullivan and Brennan understood they were in an impossible situation. They could try to arrest Johnson, but Johnson's bodyguard was armed and was clearly willing to use his weapon to protect Johnson. They could try to fight their way out, but the crowd on the sidewalk had grown to over 40 people now, all watching, all clearly on Johnson's side. If this turned into a violent confrontation, if shots were fired, the officers would be outnumbered and would have to explain why they'd been beating a black man for no reason in a neighborhood where they weren't supposed to be. O'Sullivan lowered his nightstick. Fine, we'll leave. But this isn't over. You just assaulted police officers. You threatened us. That's going to have consequences. Johnson smiled again. I didn't assault anyone. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply explained the situation to you. And now you're leaving. So everybody wins. The two officers helped the beaten man to his feet. The man could barely stand. His face was swollen. His lip was split. His eye was closing. His shirt was torn and bloody. He looked at Johnson with an expression of disbelief and gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for saving me. Johnson nodded. What's your name? Marcus. Marcus Williams. You have family, Marcus? Yes, sir. Wife and 3 children. You go home to them. And if these officers ever bother you again, you send word to the Palm Cafe on 125th Street. Ask for Bumpy Johnson. I'll make sure they never bother you again. O'Sullivan and Brennan walked to their patrol car, got in, and drove away. The crowd on the sidewalk erupted in applause, 40 people clapping and cheering because they'd just witnessed something they'd never thought they'd see. A black man standing up to white police officers. A black man stopping police brutality. A black man protecting one of their own when the law wouldn't protect them. Johnson helped Marcus Williams into his Cadillac and told Hewlett to drive Williams home. Then Johnson stood on that sidewalk for another few minutes, talking to people in the crowd, making sure everyone understood what had just happened and what it meant. By the next morning, the story had spread throughout Harlem. Bumpy Johnson had stopped NYPD officers from beating a black man on Lenox Avenue, had stood between the victim and the police, had threatened the officers, had forced them to leave. and nobody had been arrested. Nobody had been shot. The confrontation had ended with the victim safe and the police retreating. Before we finish this story, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from, and subscribe, because the aftermath of this night changed Harlem policing forever. The consequences came in waves. Within 48 hours, NYPD leadership launched an internal investigation into why Officers O'Sullivan and Brennan had been on Lenox Avenue beating a civilian when they were supposed to be on patrol in a completely different part of the city. The investigation discovered that the two officers had been running a protection racket, had been demanding money from Harlem businesses in exchange for not harassing them, had been operating without authorization for months. Both officers were suspended pending further investigation. Within 3 months, both were fired from the NYPD. O'Sullivan faced criminal charges for extortion and was convicted, serving 2 years in state prison. Brennan accepted a plea deal and left New York entirely. But the impact extended far beyond those two officers. NYPD leadership understood that Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated something dangerous, that he had the power to protect Harlem residents from police brutality, that he had leverage over corrupt officers, that he could rally community support in ways that made policing Harlem more complicated. Over the following months, NYPD changed how they operated in Harlem, not because they suddenly became less racist or more concerned about civil rights, but because Johnson had proven he could make police officers' lives difficult if they crossed certain lines. Random beatings of black civilians decreased, not eliminated, but decreased. Officers were more careful about when and where they used violence. They understood that someone was watching, someone who could fight back. Marcus Williams, the man Johnson saved that night, lived another 40 years. He raised his 3 children, worked as a mechanic, never forgot the night that Bumpy Johnson stepped between him and 2 police officers who were beating him to death. At Williams' funeral in 1995, his family told the story. How Bumpy Johnson had saved their father's life. How one man's courage had changed everything. And Bumpy Johnson, he never mentioned the incident publicly, never bragged about it, never used it for publicity or to enhance his reputation. But in Harlem, everyone knew. The story was told and retold. The night Bumpy Johnson stopped the police. The night one man's courage demonstrated that resistance was possible even against overwhelming power. When Johnson died in 1968, hundreds of Harlem residents attended his funeral. Many of them mentioned that night on Lenox Avenue. That was when we knew, one woman said, that somebody was willing to stand up for us, that we weren't alone, that even against the police, even against the system, we had someone who would fight back. That's the story of August 17th, 1955, the night Bumpy Johnson stopped 2 police officers from beating Marcus Williams, the night that changed how NYPD operated in Harlem, the moment when one criminal became something more than a gangster, became a protector, became someone willing to use his power, not just for profit, but for justice, in a world where justice for black people was rare and precious, and worth fighting for, even when fighting meant risking everything.